They thank you for your service with a plastic smile and a handshake, but they'll sell the dirt beneath your boots the moment you turn your back. Most people think a soldier's greatest threat is on the front lines, but the real predators are the ones sitting at your dinner table, waiting for you to bleed so they can feast. I spent 12 years defending a flag for people who used my absence to dismantle my life brick by brick. Now, the only thing left to defend is a house that's already been stolen by my own blood. And I'm realizing that some wars don't end with a treaty. They end with a choice between a badge and a brother. The desert heat of my final deployment was nothing compared to the cold, sterile air that hit me when I walked into my mother's bedroom. She looked like a ghost, a frail collection of bones lost in a sea of tangled sheets and beeping monitors. On her nightstand, tucked under a glass of water, was a final notice of foreclosure printed on thick, expensive cardstock. I picked it up, the paper crinkling in my calloused hand, and realized that while I was clearing rooms in a foreign city, someone was clearing out my mother's life. I stood in the kitchen of our ancestral home, the floorboards creaking under my weight like they were groaning in pain. The sink was stained with rust, and the cupboards were bare, but the walls were still covered in photos of me in uniform and my brother Julian in a graduation gown. I remembered the monthly wire transfers I'd sent home for years. Thousands of dollars meant to pay off the mortgage and keep this roof over her head. Now, looking at the legal documents strewn across the table, I realized that money hadn't gone to the bank. It had vanished into a black hole. As the local sheriff arrived an hour later, his boots thudding softly on the porch, he avoided my eyes. He was a man I'd grown up with, a man who used to call me a hero every time I came home on leave. He handed me a business card for Vance Development Group and told me the eviction was scheduled for the end of the week. He didn't have to say who owned the company. The name on the card was Julian's, embossed in gold that seemed to mock the grime of the room. I drove to the downtown office of Vance Development, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel of a rental car. The building was a monolith of glass and steel, a monument to the kind of progress that eats old neighborhoods alive. Inside, the air smelled of expensive cologne and high-end espresso, a world away from the mud and copper scent of the field. I bypassed the receptionist, my stride fueled by a decade of muscle memory and a mounting volcanic rage that I couldn't suppress. Julian sat behind a desk that probably cost more than our mother's car, looking polished and untouched by the world. He didn't flinch when I slammed the foreclosure notice onto his mahogany workspace, scattering his neat piles of blueprints. He looked up at me with a calculated, pitying expression, the kind a scientist gives a specimen under a microscope. "It's a strategic move, Leo," he said, his voice as smooth as riverstone. "That property is worth triple its current value if we level it and build the new complex." I leaned over the desk, the shadow of my frame blocking the sunlight that streamed through his floor-to-ceiling windows. I asked him where the money went. The combat pay, the hazard bonuses, the literal blood equity I had sent him every single month. He didn't deny taking it. Instead, he justified it as an initial investment into the firm that would eventually take care of us all. He spoke about market trends and urban density, while our mother was upstairs in a house that was no longer hers, breathing through a machine. As the evening settles softly around us, let me share these words just as they are, with care and honesty. The confrontation turned sharp when I realized he had planned this from the very first check I sent home 6 years ago. He had used my trust as a weapon, knowing I was too far away to audit the books or check the deed. He called it an unfortunate necessity of growth, claiming that the ancestral home was an anchor dragging the family into poverty. To him, the house wasn't a memory or a sanctuary. It was just a liability that needed to be liquidated for his vision of the future. I walked back out into the humid afternoon air, the silence of the city feeling more dangerous than any ambush I'd ever survived. I saw a group of protesters gathered across the street from Julian's office, holding signs about veterans' rights and corporate greed. Some of them recognized me from the local news clips of my return, and they began to cheer, calling me a warrior for the people. They didn't understand that the man they were protesting was the same boy I used to protect from bullies on the playground. That evening, I sat on the front porch of the house, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn like long, dark fingers. I started cleaning my old service pistol, the familiar weight of the steel providing a grounding comfort I couldn't find in words. Neighbors walked by, some offering sympathetic nods and others whispering behind their hands about the troubled soldier and the successful brother. The town was already picking sides, turning our family tragedy into a spectator sport for their own moral entertainment. I spent the night looking through old bank statements Julian had forged, seeing the trail of digital breadcrumbs he'd left behind. He was a master of the legal gray area, making sure everything he did was technically within the law while being morally bankrupt. He had counted on me staying a soldier forever, a distant figurehead he could use to bolster his image while he gutted my inheritance. The realization that I was just a prop in his success story made the air in the room feel heavy and toxic. By dawn, I had mapped out the property like a tactical map, identifying every entrance and every weak point of the structure. I wasn't just a son protecting his mother anymore. I was a specialist preparing for a siege against a domestic threat. If the law was on Julian's side, then the law was no longer something I felt obligated to uphold. I moved my mother's bed to the center of the house, away from the windows, and began to barricade the doors with the furniture I had grown up with. A local news crew pulled up to the curb just as I was hammering the final boards over the front windows. A young reporter approached the porch, her microphone extended like a peace offering, asking if I had a statement for the community. I looked directly into the camera, my face a mask of cold determination, and told them that some ground is worth dying for. I didn't mention my brother by name, but I knew he was watching from his glass tower, seeing his investment turn into a fortress. Inside the darkened house, the only light came from the flickering screen of the medical monitors and a single flashlight on the kitchen counter. I could hear my mother's labored breathing, a rhythmic reminder of what was actually at stake in this Cold War. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts from Julian, ranging from legal threats to desperate pleas for me to act like a rational adult. He didn't understand that I was acting like exactly what the country had trained me to be, a man who holds the line at any cost. The final paragraph of this first part of the story finds me sitting in the dark, listening to the sound of a heavy rain beginning to pelt the roof. I thought about the men I had served with, men who had died for ideals that seemed so simple when we were in the sand. Now, those ideals were being tested in a suburban cul-de-sac by a man who shared my DNA and none of my honor. I knew that when the sun came up, the sheriff would return with a team to remove us, and I would have to decide if I was willing to pull the trigger on the life I had fought so hard to return to. As the sun didn't rise so much as the sky simply turned a bruised, sickly gray behind the plywood I had nailed over the windows, I watched the perimeter through a small gap in the timber, my pulse steadying into that familiar, rhythmic thrum of a man waiting for the breach. Outside, the morning mist clung to the overgrown lawn, and for a moment, the world looked as desolate and abandoned as the villages I'd left behind across the ocean. Then, the first black SUV rounded the corner, its tires crunching on the gravel with a sound like bones snapping under a heavy boot. The vehicle belonged to Julian's private security firm, a group of hired muscle dressed in tactical gear that mocked the uniform I had worn for real. They stepped out with the practiced arrogance of men who knew the law was on their side, their faces hidden behind mirrored shades and professional indifference. One of them held a megaphone, his voice booming through the quiet street, ordering me to vacate the premises for the, quote, safety of the occupant. They were talking about my mother like she was a piece of hazardous waste rather than a human being who had birthed both the man inside and the man paying their salaries. I didn't answer through the megaphone. I answered by sliding the deadbolt home with a metallic clack that echoed through the hollow hallway. I could hear my mother stirring in the living room, her voice a thin, raspy thread, asking if the rain had finally stopped. I went to her side, kneeling by the hospital bed and taking her hand, which felt as light and dry as a fallen leaf. I told her everything was fine, that we were just keeping the noise out. But the lie tasted like ash in my mouth as I checked the safety on my sidearm. The first blow against the front door wasn't a ram, but a heavy, authoritative knock from the sheriff, who had returned with a look of profound exhaustion. He shouted through the wood, calling me Leo, and pleading with me not to turn a civil matter into a tactical engagement. He talked about my record, my medals, and the disgrace this would bring to the branch if I didn't step aside and let the banks have their due. Every word he spoke felt like a betrayal, a reminder that the community's respect for a soldier only lasts as long as the soldier stays in his lane. From the back of the crowd, I saw Julian emerge, shielded by two guards like he was a visiting dignitary in a hostile zone. He looked at the house with a mixture of disgust and impatience, checking his watch as if our mother's final moments were an inconvenience to his quarterly earnings. He gestured toward the door, giving the sheriff a silent, sharp nod that said the time for talking was over and the time for progress had begun. It was a cold, corporate execution of a family's history, signed in gold ink and enforced by men with badges. They started with the power, cutting the lines so the hum of the refrigerator and the glow of the hallway lights died instantly. The only thing that remained was the internal battery of my mother's ventilator, its steady, rhythmic beep, counting down the minutes we had left before the silence became permanent. I had prepared for this, hooking up a small portable generator in the cellar. But the sudden darkness felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a tomb that Julian was trying to seal from the outside. A brick shattered the high window in the kitchen, sending a spray of glass across the linoleum where we used to eat Sunday breakfast. I didn't flinch, but I moved into the shadows of the hallway, my eyes adjusting to the gloom with the practiced ease of a night hunter. I could hear them whispering outside, debating whether to use gas or a forced entry, treating my childhood home like a drug den or a sniper's nest. They weren't fighting a criminal. They were fighting a man who knew exactly how to make every inch of that hallway a nightmare to traverse. I found a ledger in the basement that Julian had missed, a physical record Mother had kept of every cent I'd sent home over the years. It was filled with her shaky handwriting, noting how proud she was of her hero son and how she trusted Julian to make the family's future bright. The irony was a jagged blade in my gut, seeing her hope documented on the very pages that proved her betrayal. Julian hadn't just stolen the money, he had stolen the peace of mind she deserved in her final days, all to build a legacy of glass and ego. As I speak, imagine the words settling gently, just as they are. The sheriff made one last attempt, his voice cracking as he told me that a news helicopter was circling overhead, filming the standoff for the world to see. He told me I was ruining my life, that the Patriotic Hero narrative was being replaced by crazed veteran holds mother hostage. I realized then that Julian wasn't just winning the physical battle, he was winning the information war, painting me as a broken man to justify his own cruelty. The audience at home would see a barricaded house and a man with a gun, never knowing the thief was the one in the tailored suit on the sidewalk. I looked at my mother, who was watching the ceiling with wide, unfocused eyes, her hand trembling as she reached for a ghost. She whispered Julian's name, and for a second, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred that threatened to break my professional restraint. She still loved the monster who was currently authorizing the men outside to tear her world apart. I had to decide if protecting her meant keeping her in this house until the end, or if it meant letting her go so I could finally deal with my brother on his own terms. The first tear gas canister thudded onto the porch, the hissing sound of the chemical release filling the air with a biting, acrid sting. I quickly pulled a damp cloth over my mother's face and fitted my own mask, the world turning into a green-tinted blur through the goggles. They were escalating, betting that I wouldn't risk her health by staying inside a cloud of toxins. It was a gamble that showed Julian didn't care if she survived the eviction, as long as he got the land cleared by the weekend. I heard the front door groan under the weight of a battering ram, the wood splintering like a ribcage under the repeated impact. I stood at the top of the stairs, my weapon lowered but ready, watching the shadows of the entry team as they prepared to breach the threshold. I thought about the "what would you do?" questions people ask in comfortable living rooms, never realizing that the answer is always written in blood. In that moment, I wasn't a sergeant, and I wasn't a hero. I was a man who had been pushed past the point of no return by the people he was supposed to trust. The door finally gave way with a deafening crash, light pouring into the smoky hallway like a holy intrusion that felt anything but sacred. I saw the first man through the door, his weapon light blinding me for a split second as he shouted commands I'd given 1,000 times myself. I didn't fire, but I didn't move, standing as a silent, grim sentinel between the invaders and the woman who had given me life. The standoff had moved from a legal dispute to a physical reality, and the first drop of blood was only a heartbeat away. The entry team froze when they saw me, their training clashing with the reality of pointing a rifle at a man wearing a silver star on his old fatigue jacket. For a few seconds, the only sound was the hissing of the gas and the beep of the medical monitor, a tense standoff in the heart of a dying home. Outside, I could hear Julian shouting for them to move, his voice high and frantic, losing the cool composure of the boardroom. He wanted the problem solved. He wanted the obstacle removed. And he didn't care how many lives were shattered to make it happen. I realized then that Julian would never stop, that his greed was a hunger that couldn't be sated by land or money alone. He needed to be the one who won, the one who proved that his vision was superior to my service. I looked down the barrel of the lead officer's rifle and saw a reflection of the man I used to be, a man following orders without questioning the soul of the person giving them. I made my choice then, a choice that would either save my mother's dignity or end both our lives in a hail of justified gunfire. I didn't raise my weapon. I raised the ledger, the physical evidence of Julian's systematic theft, and held it in the beam of their tactical lights. I shouted over the hiss of the gas, telling the entry team that they weren't protecting property. They were serving as the cleanup crew for a white-collar crime. For a heartbeat, the lead officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between my medals and the frantic, shadowed figure of my brother screaming orders from the lawn. It was the first time the economic visionary looked like what he truly was, a terrified thief hiding behind a wall of men with guns. The silence that followed was broken by my mother's monitor, emitting a long, flat tone. The battery had finally surrendered. I dropped the ledger and lunged for the manual respirator, my hands pumping the plastic bellows to keep her lungs inflated in the acrid, stinging air. The officers watched, their weapons lowering inch by inch, as they witnessed the crazed veteran fighting a desperate, rhythmic battle to keep an old woman breathing. The reality of the scene, the gas, the splintered wood, and the dying mother shattered the clinical narrative Julian had sold to the city. Outside, the sheriff finally pushed past the security perimeter, his face twisted with a mixture of shame and sudden clarity as he saw the state of the house. He barked an order for the gas to be neutralized and for the entry team to stand down, his voice cracking with the weight of a decade of misplaced trust. He looked at Julian, who was still checking his watch and muttering about billable hours and delays, and saw the monster he had been enabling. The law hadn't changed, but the moral atmosphere of the street had shifted from an eviction to a crime scene. Paramedics rushed into the smoke-filled hallway, their bright uniforms a jarring contrast to the dark, tactical grime of the siege. They took the respirator from my cramped hands, their professional movements a silent rebuke to the violence that had preceded them. As they wheeled my mother's bed toward the shattered front door, she opened her eyes for a fleeting second, looking at the ruins of her home with a heartbreakingly vacant stare. She didn't look for me. She looked for the son who had already sold the floor she was rolling across. I followed the gurney out onto the porch, my eyes squinting against the harsh, unforgiving glare of the morning sun and the flashing lights of the media trucks. Julian tried to approach, his face contorted into a mask of faux concern for the cameras, but I stepped into his path, my shadow looming over him like a judgment. I didn't strike him, though every nerve in my body screamed for it. Instead, I leaned in and whispered that the ledger was already being live-streamed to the local news by a friend in the unit. His economic vision wasn't just stalling. It was about to become a federal investigation into wire fraud and elder abuse. As the crowd that had gathered at the curb fell silent, I stood on the porch, a broken soldier in a broken house, watching my brother's empire begin to crumble in real time. The Patriotic Hero and the successful CEO were both gone, replaced by two brothers who had turned a family legacy into a battlefield. Neighbors who had whispered about my instability now looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the man they had been willing to watch get dragged out in zip ties. The victory felt like a hollow, cold weight, a right choice that had left nothing but wreckage in its wake. The bank eventually got the land, and the Vance development signs were torn down and replaced by a state-ordered auction notice, but the house was never leveled. It stands there today, a boarded-up skeleton of a home, a monument to a war that was fought over a mortgage and a memory. Julian is currently entangled in a legal nightmare that will likely strip him of every cent he stole, leaving him with nothing but the gold-plated business cards he used to ruin us. I spend my days in a small apartment near the hospice center, sitting in a silence that is louder than any explosion I heard in the service. My mother passed away 3 days after the eviction, her heart finally giving out in a sterile hospital room that smelled of bleach and forgotten promises. She never knew that her good son was a thief, and she never knew that her hero son had been prepared to kill to keep her in a house that was already gone. I often wonder if the truth would have been a mercy or a final cruelty, a question that haunts the long, empty hours of my civilian life. I served my country to protect the American dream, only to find out that the dream is often just a nightmare, dressed in a suit and tie. Now, I walk past the old neighborhood sometimes, looking at the no trespassing signs and the overgrown weeds that have claimed the yard where we used to play. People still argue in the comments of the local news articles, debating whether I was a vigilante or a victim, and whether Julian was a criminal or just a businessman caught in a bad deal. There are no medals for the war I fought at home, and there are no parades for the man who saved his mother's dignity by destroying his brother's life. I am a veteran of a different kind of combat now, one where the enemy wears your face and the wounds never truly heal. As the story ends, not with a handshake or a thank you, but with the cold, hard reality of a family that cannibalized itself for a piece of dirt. I speak softly, letting the weight settle like dusk over a quiet field. I made my choice, and I live with the quiet, heavy consequence of a house that stands empty, a gentle warning to anyone who thinks loyalty is stronger than greed. And as the screen fades to black on the slideshow of my life, the only thing left is the "what would you do" that lingers in the air, drifting slowly like the sting of tear gas that never quite clears. Some secrets rebuild families, but the truth I found only left a trail of ashes and a debt that can never be paid in full. As the story unfolds, slowly, gently, I defended the world for people who stole my home. My brother used my combat pay to evict our dying mother, while the town watched and cheered for progress. Was I a hero for holding the line? Or a madman for turning a house into a war zone? What would you do if the person you trusted most turned your sacrifice into their profit?